Alright everybody, sit down and welcome to Photography 101. I'm your teacher today. My name is @Benjamin Ellis, which is a weird name for a teacher, but there you go. I hope you've done the required reading and you understand how to use your camera, because today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle.
I don't have a title card, but if I did, I'd put it here.
Now, simply put, the exposure triangle is what dictates the exposure or brightness of your image. It consists of three things: the aperture of your lens, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Each of these three settings can be used to determine the brightness of your image, but each setting also has an additional effect which you need to be aware of and understand in order to craft your ideal image. First is the aperture. The aperture is the hole within your lens through which light can pass through, and the wider the hole, the more light can get through to your camera sensor. The more light gets through, the brighter the image. Now, aperture is expressed as a number next to the letter F, F being short for f-stop, and the larger the number, the smaller the aperture. So for example, an image shot at f1.8 will give you a much brighter image than had it been shot at f8. However, aperture also affects something called your depth of field, which determines how much of your image is in focus. So the wider your aperture, the narrower your depth of field. So if you're looking to do portrait photography, for example, like I do, and if you want to get that blurry background you typically see, having a wide aperture will help to achieve that look. Next up, we have shutter speed. The way a camera functions is by lifting a shutter and exposing a camera sensor to light. And shutter speed determines how long that shutter is open for. And you might have already guessed, the longer the shutter is open, the more light is exposed onto the sensor, and thus the brighter your image becomes. Shutter speed is expressed in seconds and fractions of seconds. Now this here is how your camera will display it. The quote marks indicate seconds, so this here would be an exposure of 2 seconds. Now 1 second, and here we get into fractions. And you know it's a fraction because there's no quote mark. So this would be 1/2 of 1 second, 1/30th of a second, all the way up to 1/8000th of a second in the case of my camera. Now the secondary effect of shutter speed, or the primary effect, depending on what you're doing with it, is that it also dictates how much motion blur is in your image. Now I'm not going to go into why, because this is Photography 101 after all, but essentially the longer your exposure, the brighter your image, and the more motion blur you will also have. Which isn't really an issue if your subject is perfectly still and your camera is perfectly still, but it's definitely something to keep in mind for when you're outside of those very specific circumstances. Sometimes having more motion blur can actually be advantageous if you're doing long exposure photography, for example, and you want to get those smooth waters that you see or those light streaks. But having a long exposure is the core of what lets that work. And lastly, we have ISO. ISO is pretty straightforward compared to the other two settings, and it controls how sensitive the sensor is to light. Expressed as ISO and then a number, and the higher the number, the brighter the image, the lower the number, the darker the image. Pretty straightforward. Now, ISO is best thought of as artificially brightening your image, since you're not actually doing anything to increase the amount of light on your sensor, and thus it does have its own issues to keep in mind. Essentially, the higher you push your ISO setting, the more it will degrade the actual image. At the lower end of the ISO, the degradation can be very minimal and often not even noticeable, but at the higher end you can start to introduce artifacts such as loss of sharpness, color casts, and most commonly visual noise. This generally means that the lower you can keep your ISO, the higher quality of an image you will have. Though as technology is advancing, cameras are getting better and better at dealing with the artifacts created by having a high ISO. The Sony a7S comes to mind for having insanely good ISO capabilities. That's a free plug to Sony, you're welcome. I don't shoot with Sony, so I don't know why I did that. So, with all this knowledge, how do we use that to craft our image? Well, let's use a live example of the thought process you would go through when you're choosing your settings. So let's say we're choosing a portrait. First of all, decide the aperture. So, how shallow do I want my depth of field to be? How much do I want to have in focus? How blurry do I want the background to be? Decide that first before even worrying about the brightness of the image. The next thing to think about is motion blur. How much motion blur do I want to have? In the case of a portrait, probably not very much. So I'd set the shutter speed to be very high to cut out that motion blur as much as possible. As I said before, you always want to be using as low an ISO as you possibly can. So I'm going to set my ISO to 200, which is the lowest in my particular camera. Now, since I've set my shutter speed so high and my aperture so low, my image unfortunately is now coming out quite dark. so I need to adjust my settings to compensate for this. I don't really want to increase my ISO unless I absolutely have to, so instead I'm going to reduce my shutter speed, which will introduce more motion blur, but it's such a small amount that it introduces, it's basically negligible. So now with my settings adjusted, I'm able to take an image with the qualities that I want: a shallow depth of field, the blurred background, a lack of motion blur, a low ISO, and good exposure. So now we get to the end of the lesson where I tell you to like and subscribe because it helps me out a lot. A weird thing to say in a classroom, I know, but what are you gonna do? Thank you all so much for listening, except you, James, you little sh*. I see you at the back there chewing your gum, you f***. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you all again next week. Class dismissed.